On the morning of January 28, 1986, it was cold in Florida. It was so cold that long icicles hung from the launch tower. People who had gathered to watch the Space Shuttle Challenger fly were bundled in winter coats, their breath turning to fog in the air. This was not normal weather for a launch. On board, 7 astronauts prepared for their journey. One of them, Krista McAuliffe, was a high school teacher. She was going to be the first ordinary citizen in space. Her students and millions of people around the world were watching. There was a feeling of excitement, a sense that this flight was special. It was a mission meant to show that space was for everyone. But for all the excitement, there was a deep, unspoken problem. A danger that a small group of people knew about. A flaw that was hiding in plain sight. The disaster that was about to happen was not an accident. It was a choice. How do people, smart people, make a choice like that? To understand what happened, we have to remember what the space shuttle meant to people. After the moon landings, the shuttle was the next big step. It was not a single-use rocket that would be thrown away. It was a reusable spacecraft, something that looked and landed like an airplane. The plan was to make space travel routine, almost like a commute. NASA called it the Space Transportation System. It was supposed to be a reliable space truck, making regular trips to orbit and back. The program had many successes. Shuttles carried satellites into orbit, conducted science experiments, and fixed broken equipment in space. For the public, it seemed like NASA had perfected space travel. The image was one of confidence and control. The shuttles flew, again and again. Each successful mission built more trust in the machine. People saw the astronauts, the brilliant engineers, and the gleaming white orbiter, and they believed in its safety. This belief was important. It was the foundation of the whole program. The shuttle was a symbol of American achievement, a piece of technology that seemed to prove anything was possible. It was a complex machine made of millions of parts, all working together. And the belief was that the people in charge understood every single one of those parts. They believed the system they had built was close to perfect. The space shuttle was not a single vehicle. It was a system. The main orbiter, the part that looked like a plane, was attached to a huge external fuel tank. And on either side of that tank were 2 solid rocket boosters. These boosters were incredibly powerful. They provided most of the thrust needed to push the shuttle off the launch pad and into the sky. Each booster was so large it had to be built in sections. These sections were stacked on top of each other at the launch site. Where the sections met, there was a joint. And to keep the hot, high-pressure gas from escaping through that joint, engineers used a simple but critical part: rubber rings. They were called O-rings. Think of a rubber gasket on a canning jar. To keep food fresh, that gasket has to create a perfect seal. The O-rings on the shuttle had a much harder job. They had to contain forces of immense power. If they failed, hot gas would burn through the side of the booster like a blowtorch. For a while, nobody thought much about the O-rings. They were just one part among millions. Then, after one of the early shuttle missions returned, engineers took the boosters apart for inspection. They found something unexpected. One of the O-rings was damaged. It looked like it had been burned or eroded. This was not supposed to happen. The design assumed the O-rings would not be damaged at all. It was a small flaw, a deviation from the plan. It was a serious concern for the engineers who found it. But the shuttle had returned safely. The backup O-ring had held. The problem was noted and studied. It was seen as a puzzle to be solved, not a crisis that needed to stop everything. The perfect machine had shown its first crack. After that first discovery, engineers watched the O-rings carefully on every flight, and the problem kept happening. On one mission, they would find a little bit of damage. On another, they might find more. The amount of erosion changed from flight to flight. Sometimes it was affected by the type of putty used in the joint. Other times, it seemed random. But with each mission, the same thing happened. The shuttle came back safely. 7 successful flights had O-ring damage. Then 10. Then more. A strange kind of logic began to set in. The engineers knew the O-rings were not working as designed. That was a fact. But the system had not failed. That was also a fact. So, the thinking started to shift. The original rule was that any erosion of the O-rings was a major problem. But now, since the shuttles were not crashing, maybe a little bit of erosion was okay. Maybe it was an acceptable risk. The flaw was still there, but because it had not caused a disaster yet, people started to get used to it. The abnormal was slowly starting to feel normal. This created a dangerous pattern. Management at NASA and at the booster manufacturer, Morton Thiokol, began to accept the flaw as a flight characteristic. It was no longer a red flag that could stop a launch. It was just another issue on a long list of things to manage. They wrote new rules, creating official allowances for a certain amount of O-ring damage. They were, in effect, rewriting the definition of what was safe. The engineers who worked on the boosters were worried. They saw the pattern and knew it was a gamble. Each successful launch was like flipping a coin and having it land on heads. Just because it landed on heads 10 times in a row did not mean it would on the 11th flip. But it was hard to argue with success. The shuttles kept flying. The missions were celebrated, and the warnings from the engineers started to sound less urgent. After the Challenger disaster, a sociologist named Diane Vaughan wanted to understand how this could have happened. She spent years studying NASA's records, memos, and meeting notes. She found this pattern of accepting a known flaw was not about a few bad people making a few bad choices. It was a problem with the culture of the organization itself. She gave it a name: the Normalization of Deviance. The idea is simple, but its effects are powerful. It starts with a deviation, a small break from the rules. Maybe you speed on the highway and don't get a ticket. The rule is to drive the speed limit, but you broke it and nothing bad happened, so you do it again. Over time, driving 5 miles over the speed limit feels normal to you. You have normalized a deviation. This is what happened with the shuttle's O-rings. The rule was that they should not be damaged, but they were, and the shuttles returned safely. So the organization, as a group, began to accept the damage as normal. The deviation became the new standard. This process is quiet. It is not a sudden decision to be reckless. It is a slow, gradual drift. With each successful flight, the evidence that the flaw was dangerous seemed to grow weaker. The evidence that they could get away with it grew stronger. People were not ignoring the problem. They were just redefining it. They convinced themselves that the risk was understood and manageable. But they were wrong. The risk was just waiting for the right conditions to show itself. The night before the Challenger launch, the weather forecast was a major concern. The temperature was predicted to drop into the 20s Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous launch. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, were alarmed. They knew from tests that the rubber O-rings became stiff in the cold. A stiff O-ring would not be able to create a proper seal at the moment of ignition. It would be like trying to seal a jar with a hard, plastic ring instead of a soft, rubber one. A conference call was arranged between the engineers and managers at Thiokol and managers at NASA. On that call, the engineers laid out their case. One engineer, Roger Boisoli, had been warning about the O-rings for months. He and his colleagues presented charts showing how the O-ring damage was worse on colder days. They argued that launching in such extreme cold was a risk they had never faced before. They could not guarantee the seals would work. Their official recommendation was clear: do not launch. What happened next shows how systems can pressure people into making terrible choices. The NASA managers on the call were frustrated. They had a launch to get to. There was pressure to fly. A manager from NASA was shocked by the recommendation to delay. "My God, Thiokol," he said, "when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The pressure was now on the Thiokol managers. Their own engineers were telling them not to launch. But their biggest customer, NASA, was clearly pushing them to approve the flight. A senior manager at Thiokol turned to one of his engineers and said something that would become famous. He said it was time to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. This was a pivotal moment. The decision was no longer just about the data. It was about schedules, budgets, and relationships. This is a classic example of groupthink. The desire to please the customer and maintain group harmony began to silence the dissenting voices of the engineers. The burden of proof was flipped. The engineers were being asked to prove, without a doubt, that the shuttle would fail. They could not do that. They could only say that it was a very big risk. In the end, the managers at Thiokol overruled their own experts. They told NASA to proceed with the launch. On the morning of the launch, the astronauts boarded the Challenger. The ice was still on the tower. The final decision was made to go. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The two solid rocket boosters ignited. At that exact moment, a camera recorded a small puff of black smoke coming from a joint on the right side booster. It was the O-ring, made stiff by the cold, failing to seal the joint. Hot gas had escaped. For a fraction of a second, the problem was visible to the world, but no one knew what they were seeing. For the first minute, the flight seemed normal. The shuttle cleared the tower and climbed into the bright blue sky. The astronauts were likely unaware of any problem. Inside mission control, the data on the screens looked fine. The shuttle was picking up speed, heading for orbit. But the damaged joint was not healing. The small puff of smoke had been replaced by a flickering flame growing in the slipstream. It was like a blowtorch burning through the side of the booster and pointing directly at the huge external fuel tank filled with liquid hydrogen and oxygen. At 73 seconds into the flight, the fuel tank failed. In an instant, the shuttle was engulfed in a massive fireball. The vehicle broke apart, and the 7 astronauts were lost. The crowd on the ground, which had been cheering moments before, fell silent. In mission control, controllers stared at their screens in disbelief, watching a cloud of smoke where the shuttle was supposed to be. The predictable outcome, warned about for years, had finally arrived. In the weeks after the disaster, the country was in shock. President Reagan appointed a special commission, known as the Rogers Commission, to investigate what went wrong. They interviewed hundreds of NASA and contractor employees. They reviewed thousands of documents. The story of the O-rings and the warnings from the engineers began to come out. But the story was complicated, full of technical charts and internal memos. It was hard for the public to understand the core problem. One member of the commission was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist named Richard Feynman. Feynman was known for being brilliant, curious, and impatient with bureaucracy. He wanted to get to the simple truth. During a public hearing, he performed a simple demonstration. He got a small piece of the O-ring material, the same kind used on the shuttle. He compressed it with a small C-clamp and dipped it into a glass of ice water, just like the ice water that had been sitting on the launch pad. He let it sit there for a bit. Then, in front of the cameras, he took the clamp off. The rubber material did not spring back to its original shape. It stayed flat and compressed. It had lost its resiliency in the cold. With that one simple act, Feynman showed the entire world the physical cause of the disaster. He cut through all the complex arguments and showed that the problem was basic physics. The seals would not work in the cold. It was a truth that had been known, but not accepted by the people in charge. The story of the Challenger is not just about rockets and O-rings. It is a story about us. The same force that led to the disaster, the normalization of deviance, happens all around us, in smaller ways, every day. It can happen at a hospital, where a nurse skips a safety checklist once because she is in a hurry. Nothing bad happens. So she does it again. Soon, skipping the checklist becomes her normal routine. It can happen in an office, where a team promises a customer a deadline they know they probably can't meet. They get away with it by working long hours. So they do it on the next project. Soon, impossible deadlines become the normal way of doing business. It happens in our own lives. We tell a small white lie and get away with it. We drive a little too fast. We put off fixing something that is broken. Each time we get away with a small deviation from what is right or safe, we make it easier to do it again. Our brain learns to accept the new, lower standard. The Challenger disaster is a warning. It shows how a group of dedicated, intelligent people can drift into a disaster, one small, seemingly harmless decision at a time. It reminds us that the most dangerous problems are often the ones we have learned to live with. And it shows that it takes a special kind of courage to be the person who raises their hand and says, "Stop," when something feels wrong, especially when everyone else seems to think it is normal.